My name is Monica Adams, and right now I'm here representing Take Back the Land Madison as a local action group, and also Take Back the Land movement nationally. And really what the movement is about, it's about gaining community control over land through direct action, which we talk about as positive action, but a lot of you may know it as civil disobedience, essentially nonviolence, civil disobedience.
My name is Michael Kane. I'm an organizer based in Boston with the National Alliance of HUD Tenants, and also I work locally as an organizer with the Mass Alliance of HUD Tenants. We're a tenant union of tenant groups in privately owned HUD subsidized housing. It's a sector of housing. It's not public housing. It's privately owned buildings, but they all have in common HUD subsidies. And there's a perpetual crisis because of that contradiction of owners trying to get out, convert to market rate. Our organization is structured as a union. I'm an organizer.
My name is Eric Crawford. I'm a resident of public housing, as well as a resident association president representing the largest public housing here in the country, New York City. And for the last 13 years, I have had the opportunity of organizing residents of public housing in order to secure, preserve what we have, which is the only form of low-income housing. Had the opportunity of working with other organizations, both locally, Community Voices Heard, national organizations like Right to the City, and many others, NPA, and we have been working hard to preserve what we know is our homes, and it is a hard fight. As Michael alluded to, the differences between public housing, multifamily, Section 8 houses, there's a difference, and we need to know those differences because it's important. Our hope is that we be able to preserve that we have lived in for me all of my life thus far, and that is public housing. And hopefully with this forum, this network will start where we can find common goals, what we can do to bridge the gap that exists amongst us all, and hopefully preserve what we all need, and that is low-income housing.
So I'm Mo George. I'm from Community Voices Heard, CVH. And just to give you a brief background around CVH, Community Voices Heard, we're about 15 years old. We were started by 3 women of color on welfare who decided that they were no longer interested in hearing what other people felt about women on public assistance, and that since they were actually directly affected by the issues, that they should be defining those issues. So as a result, they started CVH. We're a member-led organization, and what we mean by that is that our members actually decide the campaigns we work on, the issues we work on, and are the decision-making body. Us as staff just really help to facilitate and make those happen. If you've seen us a lot lately, we've been in, all over Albany, getting arrested, doing this, going to people's house, because that's what my members want to do. And I specifically had the public housing campaign. I'm a former public housing resident, and some of the issues that we'll get into those later, but currently we're working around issues of repairs. NYCHA has, New York City Housing Authority has a backlog of 3 years of repairs. They've decided to work around some stuff on the federal level with the budget, and I think the last one is they're introducing, that it's building a lot of momentum, is called participatory budgeting, where actually the people decide and participate in the budget process. Ooh.
Good afternoon. I'm Kenneth Jackman, and I'm from Picture Homeless, and I'm a housing campaign leader, among other things. Picture Homeless is a grassroots organization founded by the late Louis Higgins Jr. and Anthony Williams in November of 1999, in response to then Mayor Giuliani's bullying of the homeless population. We are and will always be led by homeless and formerly homeless people. Our current housing campaign began in 2006 when the organization, along with Manhattan Borough President Scott Springer, conducted a count of vacant apartments in the borough. We found over 29,000 vacancies, which would have housed the homeless shelter population in its entirety of that year. From this, we drafted legislation called Annual Census of Vacant Buildings or Lots, known as Intro 48 in the City Council. Simply, it would change the city charter and mandate an annual count of all vacant properties. We feel this is the first step towards real affordable housing in New York City. Starting in this April, actually April 5th, we in collaboration with Hunter College and the public will do the count ourselves. We will write the methodology for future counts and prove to the city can be done with real experience. We also have a civil rights committee, and we're working on disorderly conduct because police have targeted homeless population and to continuously issue disorderly conduct tickets to them.
Good morning, I'm Vic Bach. I do housing policy advocacy work with the Community Service Society, which is an anti-poverty organization based here in New York City. For the last 15 years, much of my work has been with public housing resident leaders here in New York City and at the Washington level on policies that affect public housing communities. It stems from the period when Congressman Rick Blasio was reigning over public housing reform, and we got our act together here in New York City. And ever since then, I've been working with some of the people on the panel and others on coalition building and gaining a voice for public housing residents. Thanks.
My name is Rob Robinson. I work with a policy and research group here in Manhattan called NESRI, the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative. Does work around human rights issues in particularly 4 areas: the human right to education, the human right to work with dignity, the human right to housing, and the human right to health care. My focus, basically, being formerly homeless, is in the housing area, and I serve as a special advisor to NESRI's campaign to restore national housing rights.
And I'm Peter Marcuse. I teach at Columbia in the urban planning program, and my field is housing, and I'm teaching a course on mortgage foreclosures at the moment and what can be done positively about turning them into a basis of extracting some occupied housing from the housing market and making it non-profit, making it community-based, community land trust, mutual housing associations, whether that might be an answer to the mortgage foreclosure crisis.
Well, Madison has a huge disparities in terms of achievement gaps, disproportionate minority confinement. So it's more or less known that Madison has a salient race problem. So now when we think about space, you know, we think about space in 3 types of ways. We think about it as like in cultural space, political space, and physical space. So what does it look like for a group that is fairly small in numbers, who is hyper-policed, to take space, essentially, to take political space and build a movement and say, hey, you know, we're not going to take this anymore. We're going to take over our land, or we're going to take back the land, right? And what does it look like for a group of people who are disenfranchised to take up the cultural space that's also necessary to be able to do something like that? And then 3, what is the physical space that you'll take back, right? So if we think about, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Madison, but in Madison, folks of color live in different pockets throughout the city in low-income housing, right? And Take Back the Land, we're trying to take back houses that that the banks that were bailed out, I don't think they technically own them, but whatever, that own them. And so when we think about space in terms of where folks are located, we're essentially taking a group of people who have been forced in different areas throughout their experience in Madison due to gentrification and so on and so forth. And we are essentially taking back space, or taking land in spaces that are white politically, that are where white people live, and that have very white culture in those spaces. So it's very conflicting for us to be able to do that, and it's very, very challenging to be able to do that work. And so what that means for us in terms of space is not only do we have to identify physical spaces that we think we can win, that but also spaces that are affirming, because what is also very problematic for us in this movement is how do we choose a place where the family will be safe, for example, or how do we choose a place that people do want to call home, essentially. So I think the question for space for us happens, like I said, in both a physical, cultural, and a political way.
But there's typically a culture of fear and harassment by private landlords and management agents who don't want people to organize at the building level, because they can make a lot of money if they think they can make more money if people are not organized. So typically there's no organization at all. Most people have no clue that they could be out on the street if their subsidy contracts are ended in the near future. So it typically takes, not always, but it usually takes some outside organizing group with the capacity to know about those things and the capacity to go in and help people form a group in the building level. And our practice is to organize democratic organizations, tenant unions at the building level that are democratic, meet regularly, representative of all, of all the diversity in the buildings. It's a very diverse community, racially, ethnically, mostly women. Most households are led by women in HUD housing. And to try to overcome those divisions, build unity at the building level, and most importantly, groups that are independent of the owners and management agents, and that's usually a struggle. People then form alliances at the city, usually in a city level or a neighborhood level, but we learned early on that you can't get very far in saving HUD housing, privately owned HUD housing, unless you deal with HUD. And you can't do it at the city level because the people in Washington make the decisions. So the people that were doing this work in the 80s, the tenant leaders who were doing that work in the 80s realized that to get somewhere they had to form a national union. It was the tenant leaders that came together in Washington who formed NAT in the late 80s, early 90s, and said that we needed to have a voice for ourselves in Washington, that we can't leave it up to advocates, well-intentioned advocates or agencies, that we need to do it ourselves. We need to have our own voices heard. So NAT was built as at the national level as a union with tenant groups as the members, sending delegates who then elect a board based on HUD regions. So it's a combination of building level organizing, it's a building block, but with area-wide coalitions that has some resources to do organizing and can cover multiple buildings in the area, like a Central Labor Council, and then a national union with a board that goes to Washington 3 or 4 times a year and meets by conference call much more frequently to make decisions in set direction.
What public housing in New York City looks like, there are 180,000 apartments, and it houses, officially on record, 4,630 something, 400,600. But actually on record, that's on record. But actually, more realistically, we calculated at about maybe half. Is it 500,000 to 550 now? Maybe. Yeah, somewhere around that number. Because folks, due to income and other family reasons, have doubled up into apartments. So for us, it is really about, and when I say us, I say myself and Eric, it's really about getting into the buildings and actually talking to folks. Eric is a tenants association president, so we at CVH, we work really well, and a lot of our members are part of the tenants association structure, and we try to actually come together to find solutions, because at the base of it all, everybody is trying to preserve New York City housing in the city, and public housing specifically in New York, as we look at the fact that we are more and more switching to a have and have-not system, and affordable housing in New York is a dying breed. So when you really look at the housing authority here, we really have to really go into the buildings. We're in there talking to folks. We just did we're actually in the process of finishing up a actual survey in the housing authorities, where we surveyed about 5,000 people to get a sense of some of the actual issues. So for us, it's actually in the buildings talking to folks and actually bringing folks out to whatever action that we're doing, if we decide to do a press conference or a rally or a civil disobedience, whatever members have decided that they want to do to push forward, is how we really figure out how the base is. Like, it's in the building, so we're in the buildings. You know what I mean? So, and it's in public housing, so we're talking to folks in public housing, in their building across this city, irregardless of what folks say about various projects. That's where we need to be. That's where my members are talking to folks, and that's where staff is as well.
So it's hard, because in public housing, I can be frank to say residents are distracted with their own individual things. They believe change is not possible. Yeah, my roof been leaking forever. I've been complaining forever, so why should I come to this meeting and organize with you to go and fight Washington when I can't get my manager to come here with a hammer and a screwdriver just to put up something for me? So the point is coming to understand that there's a bigger issue that we must address. In order to address the bigger issues, Then we can worry about the small things. And what I want them to understand, I don't mean that your apartment issue is small, but there's something larger. We don't have money into public housing. We need money so that we can address your issue. You've been waiting on a paint job. You've been waiting on that toilet to be fixed. But if we don't come together to fight Washington so that we can get the money we need to address those issues, then we'll be in the same place. So I believe that organizing and building capacity and getting people involved means more than just saying, come and fight with me on this issue. It's about maintaining interest. It's about making sure my space is inviting. So whoever you are, rather you're gay, straight, lesbian, bisexual, queer, those different names that I'm still learning, you should be feeling invited in my space so we can build together on those issues. And I believe once we start doing that, we'll have a better place and a better effective place to build towards that social change and social movement.
I live in a shelter. I try to get the women in my shelter to wake up and come to meetings. As Eric said, you have to have a space that's inviting. Well, picture the homeless, we have computers. Folks who are out on the street, we have a place where they can take a shower, we have a kitchen so you can get something to eat. So we try to make it like a home that we don't have at the moment. We also use computers. We have a membership list. Our lead organizer sitting in the back of the room, Sam, sends out blurbs to everybody. Our office manager does the same thing. Recently, we partnered with Councilwoman Annabelle Palmer, who's the chair of the General Welfare Committee of the City Council that oversees DHS and HRA. And I literally took my telephone, my emails, and my Facebook and got in touch with nearly 70 women I knew in the shelter system to try to get them to come out. So even though our population is scattered and our main focus is on outreach because that's the best way to reach them, we have moved into a somewhat technical age because, as Lynn said, folks think homeless people don't have phones. Well, a lot do, a lot don't.
Given a base in New York City, and as Mo indicated, 500,000, a subsidy of public housing residents here, it's amazing that there is no clear or strong voice for public housing residents in the city other than a few organizations like CVH, people like Eric, who speak up. And that's despite a wonderful set of HUD regulations. They're called 964 regulations that give public housing tenants the right to organize and in some sense kind of right to collectively bargain with the housing authority over any and all policy issues. Yet for a subsidy of 500,000, there is no voice. Part of my job is trying to keep that subsidy informed. So twice a year we have public housing forums to which we invite resident leaders to come and find out about emerging ongoing policy issues like Petra, to deal with Section 3 training and employment opportunities and a host of things, but that's clearly not enough. I'll also add that in the sort of mental map I have, the picture is one of fragmentation rather than solidarity. And it's fragmentation on several fronts. A lot of our most active CBOs and advocates for public housing, like myself, are also active in the Washington front. So we have a number of groups working Washington, and I find that the links to the resident constituency they claim to represent is unclear. How does that communication take place rather than those of us that do the lobbying, how do we know we're representing the residents that we want to? Secondly, I think there's fragmentation between the activist, professional activist left and the academic left. And I think some of that is no clearer than it was under the debate about Petra, for those of you who know about Petra, and we can talk more about that. But I think there has not been the coming together I would like to see between academics on the left and policy activists on the left who are trying to work out long-term strategies to preserve public housing.
Some of it is the activists' fault for not reaching out and thinking that, they have this concept that all the academics do is spew theory at you. Well, I'm going to beg to differ because they have embraced the work that I do, at a great level. They have embraced the work that this campaign to restore national housing rights does at an incredible level, and I know I can always turn to them for support. And we're looked at different as a campaign because of that fact. It was very easy for us to put together an anti-Petra letter and get people to sign on because that list of academics was huge, high level, and important. And then the signatures started to flow once the folks saw those academics. But I think I want to get back to the space, and this is not, I don't want this to sound like I'm wrestling with Vic or differing, but I think some of those changes are starting to happen, and I think we have to work at it as activists a little bit harder. But I want to go back to the individual organizations within the campaign. You heard Kendall speak about Picture the Homeless, so I don't have to reiterate that, but I think the Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign has a concept that's unique. You know, we're going to defend people that are living in public housing. You're not going to foreclose and put them out on the street. We're going to come with our folks from the streets of Chicago, and Big Henry, about 400 pounds, leading the crew, saying, put us out with our 100 people standing here to defend this property. It's not going to happen. It's a radical approach. But they, at the same time that they use those radical approaches, they also go into the courtrooms. When somebody's about to be foreclosed on in the courtroom, they bring 100 members into that courtroom. And you know what? All of a sudden, the judge is looking at a case different. There's community support like he's never seen before. You know, when the case is over, 100 people rise up, the courtroom empties, and decisions are starting to go in the favor of that Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign. So they're finding ways. The ways are a little bit different than we're accustomed to. The Los Angeles Community Action Network is big. You know, they don't do a lot of work in public housing, but they're starting to see public housing being torn down in LA and disappearing quickly, so they're starting to step it up. But they work with a collective on the West Coast called the Western Regional Advocacy Project, doing some big work on housing. The Los Angeles Housing Collective, individually, including LA Can, doing dynamite work to keep people in their homes, to prevent foreclosure, to do anti-eviction work. Mayday New Orleans, a lot of their work revolves around public housing. You heard me talk about the film Coming Home. A lot of the fight focuses on an individual building, as Peter alluded to. The Iberville projects down in is one of the last large complexes standing in New Orleans, and that's where the fight is located right now, to keep that public housing, to keep it out of private hands. So those fights continue, and it's always a struggle for space. It's a combination. It's also getting the residents involved. As Eric said, that's a challenge. People have a lot on their plates already, you know, and forget the other social issues. It's every day. I don't have a job, man. I don't have a job. I need a job.
And other folks who have decision-making power, essentially, within institutions started giving us phone calls and saying, okay, we're ready to talk, we're ready to compromise. And for us, we were like, wait a minute. I think we won. We could have won something, but we're not clear about what the next level was. Should we compromise? Should Take Back the Land Madison sit down in a negotiation session with the mayor? And we said no, right? I think something that makes Take Back the Land so powerful is how radical it is, and is about how clear it is that alternatives are what need to happen, and existing institutions, including governments, do not work. So Take Back the Land Madison didn't sit down and have that meeting with the mayor. And that draws into the coalition question, which is going to come up next. That's why it's important for us to be able to have strategic partners who can engage in that type of work, because we're very clear that as a movement that shouldn't be our primary role, to necessarily sit down and talk policy or reform with legislators. So I think the question of compromise is a larger question, and it's something that we struggle with both locally and both nationally, in terms of, essentially, if you win, what is the win? How do you win it? What are you willing to take? What are you willing to accept and say, okay, this is a victory? Or do we say, no, we don't, you know, we're not going to take anything you give because we're going to take everything ourselves? You know, so I think it's a larger question that we struggle with, and we're still working essentially to come up with a perfect solution and to be able to develop models.
In terms of who decides to compromise, if there's a struggle at a building level to save that particular building, it has to be the tenants who live in the building. So the key is to build a group that can make those decisions at the building level. That is not easy. It can take years to do that, usually because of the harassment that comes from the owners and management companies. But if people can overcome that challenge, then a variety of tactics, obvious tactics, press strategies, negotiations, getting elected officials involved, litigation if the owner screwed up in some way and there's a legal handle. Sometimes you can get sometimes a group, because there's a national tenant union, they can go through NAT to Washington to get changes in policies at HUD or even legislation passed that adds to the number of handles that they can use at the building level to save their homes. In Boston, we added it up recently. We've saved 11,400 apartments, one building at a time, through tenant organizing strategies over 27 years.
I'm gonna speak only for New York City, because that's the only place I have experience in. I think public housing residents have compromised too much. Every issue, the resident compromise, rather it's the public housing authority that decides that we're gonna attach some crazy service fees to your apartment repairs, or we're gonna increase your rents because we need more money. The residents of public housing here in New York compromise. I believe we need to come up with something similar to the concept of the Tea Party movement, not saying I endorse them, but we need a crazy type of movement in public housing.
You get an appointment, like Eric stated, if you call to get your bathroom fixed, you have a leak, and you get an appointment, which right now, currently, if you call for 2013 and you pay your rent, that's a compromise. Because no other landlord, and just to be clear, New York City Housing Authority is the largest landlord in New York City, gets away with what the housing authority gets away with. I live in private housing now. I spent 42 years in public housing. My landlord tells me that they're not fixing my bathroom. I'm telling him you're not seeing no money until my bathroom is finished. Housing authority residents, public housing authority residents in New York City don't have that option. So they have compromised. So my members who are public housing residents such as Eric come to us and they say to me, Mo, we're not compromising. Either he's gonna come or we're gonna follow you around. Case in point, the current chairman did not want to set a date to meet with residents of New York City. He feels that he just has to meet with the official resident structure. Residents said, no, we want you to come and meet with us. He decided not to come. My members went to his board hearing and held up a signs in the board meeting saying we want a date. And when he didn't, they followed him to his office. And the next stop would have been his home. So they don't compromise.
You reach a point where compromise isn't working. When you have buildings that have been warehoused for 40 years, and you find out one of the biggest banks in the city that got a bailout 2 years ago, now 3 years ago, has been sitting on that building this whole time and claiming, oh, there's no property, waiting for another developer to come along and take it, you get tired of compromise. So, as I said in the beginning, we had to compromise, but we reached a point where you can't compromise anymore. We're dealing with a mayor, like Mo said before, that is a rich man who doesn't understand the middle class. He definitely doesn't understand the poor. And when you find out that the quote-unquote advantage program to help you get an apartment for the city homeless went bust on Monday, and now they're talking about, instead of putting money into that program, acquiring more property to put more people in shelters, he doesn't understand the people he's supposed to be representing. So, a picture of the homeless, like I said, we got tired of compromise. When you're sleeping on a train, you can't be patient. When you're sleeping in a shelter and they're telling you to go get a job and there are no jobs out there, you can't be patient. So, as Mo said, compromise has become a dirty word in a picture of homeless.
We have a number of, in New York City itself, we have a number of local organizations and advocates representing residents. A number of them are here, key organizations that I work with. But we have to start a roundtable that meets monthly in order to keep track of what each of us was doing, and in order to find a way to, and an opportunity to support each other mutually in our separate efforts.
Do I build, or do I try to build, or even invest energy in trying to transform, essentially, a system of nonprofit organizations? Do I put energy into trying to transform a system of folks and organizations that have traditionally hurt and have oppressed our communities? And so far, the answer for us has been, in a lot of ways, no. But that doesn't mean we don't need strategic partners. So it is a battle in trying to find who those people would be, specifically when it comes down to us winning, right? If the bank calls us tomorrow and says, Monica, we'll give you these 5 houses, we're tired of you, what do I do with the houses? I'm very clear, I'm not a landlord. right? I don't necessarily have the answers to developing what that land relation would look like, considering that capitalism still exists, right? So I think in that sense we do, like Rob was saying, we do need support of academics. So it's about finding those who can be allies, who are left and radical, who can help us build or give us models for that new infrastructure that we're seeking to build.
So the cuts are very deep, and we need to have a coalition not only of housing groups, but we figured what we could pull off would be coalitions of housing groups around the HUD budget. But I don't see any other constituencies out there on the streets, unfortunately. But we need to figure out ways to get other groups mobilized in education and health, job programs, job training programs. Everything's being cut by the Tea Party Congress. So we have to form broader coalitions in the streets, outside of while lobbying at the same time, and challenge these people, hold them accountable, and throw them out of office if they don't vote to protect budgets, vote to tax the rich, end the mortgage interest deduction. There's a lot of other ways. You know, we're talking to Scott Brown's office. And he said, "Well, what else do you propose to cut?" We said, "Well, cut the war budget. Eisenhower tax rates would eliminate the deficit. You know, I'm an Eisenhower Republican. There's a lot of other solutions to this crisis besides cutting programs that affect people, poor people and working people. So that's one coalition that we started. We're going to continue it as long as it takes.
Now, if I sit down in a room and decide that someone have to be 100% like I think, I don't believe I'm going to have any alliances or coalitions building. So I think the movement needs to be being more conservative as to what other people are going to do. Can you help me reach this goal? Yes, I could. Well, this is what I'm about. Can you think you can work with that? Yeah, I can work with that. Well, what are you about? Let me see if I can work with that. Because we just got to get together for the common goal. I don't need you to come all the way with me because I have my base that's going to go with me all the way. My base is the residents that live in public housing. Those that will be affected by every issue that I talk about every day, rather it's the maintenance issue, the working issue, the need for jobs, for more housing. When you get that focus point in mind and keep in mind that you don't need no one for the long haul because you have your base for your long haul, then you'll stop interviewing people for the coalition work. Because you don't need to interview no one to be part of a coalition or an alliance. I know what you're about, I just need you to help me get here. That's my concept. I don't believe I need to be everything like you. I don't believe you have to believe and be as radical as I am. But I do need to know that I can trust you to get to this point. And when I get to this point, nice working with you. If I need you again, here's my business card, let me take yours. Let me move on with the fight.
For CBH and for my members, they are part of, I just told you earlier that I'm now the partnership director. So they're probably a part of too many coalitions and alliances, and to tell you the truth, enough to keep me working for 10 days straight. They're not against sitting on a coalition like the Housing Justice Movement and talking about what Petra, and for those that I know we've talked about that a lot, and we should probably define that for folks, is in legislation. I'm sorry, just so folks know, because y'all know y'all been hearing it. But anyway, it stands for Preserving, Enhancement, and Transformation of Rental Assistance, and it's a federal program to basically privatize and Section 8 all of public housing across this country. So so the Housing Justice Movement is one of the coalitions that my members sit on, and in that coalition, they first stated, up front that they were not interested in that bill. But it is not at all uncommon to have people who live in public housing, let's make that straight, decide that they should talk about the bill, and they should see what negotiations they can make in their favor, because as much as we say no to it, there is no active campaign going on now to say how are we going to put the $30 billion that public housing needs in this country back into the budget.
I'll be brief. In my view, the purpose of coalitions is collective action, and that can be collective action to oppose something or collective action to move something forward. It's not enough, and I rely on coalitions, particularly because I don't do organizing. I have to get access to the base through other organizations who do. But it's not enough to know whether members of a coalition are against something, whether there are some that are for, whether there are some who are undecided. The question I need to ask, and I'd love an answer to, is where is the collective discussion and debate to come forward with a collective position? Thank you.
It's not easy to join coalitions. We have started as a campaign a national phone call to try to understand how to make some of this stuff happen and let people have a space where they can dialogue and figure out how we can work together. It's slow getting off the ground, but it is working. Folks are coming up with ideas, and the biggest idea is education. We learned that the landscape is not level. You know, there are some folks that are up here with education, and there are some folks that are down here. And we need to level that playing field. So that's all, those are all ways you have to think, and those are things you have to apply. It's a challenge trying to work with alliances and coalitions, and I can't say it any other way.